I think there was a bunch of controversy in December and January, and it was swirling around who is the EF director? What is the purpose of the EF? Why is Ethereum number not going up?
Ethereum's pluralism and the open-endedness and the diversity of the community that's here, I am still bullish on Ethereum, even as it hasn't tracked with the rest of the market in certain moments. I haven't given up hope on the potential of what it can be.
I think now the EF might be the ninth largest treasury in the ecosystem. There's definitely a lot of treasuries that are larger than the EF. And while the EF is the ninth largest treasury in the ecosystem, it still funds the majority of the public goods.
The allocations didn't always make sense to the community in terms of what the priorities were that the community sensed were necessary. And I'm saying community a lot here, and that's a pretty amorphous phrase. There's actually a lot of different subcultures within Ethereum. And I think it's because of the actual diversity of different types of people who have different kinds of goals and different interests of what they think Ethereum should be.
But, potentially the crowd has a good sense of, what on a more broad general level should be funded. And so I think we can layer some of these capital allocation mechanisms.
Welcome to the Allo.Capital podcast. If you're just joining us, we're doing season. This season is about summoning Allo.Capital, a new spinout from Gitcoin that is designed to build the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet. We think there's big upside here. Capital allocation is a multi-trillion-dollar design space, and VCs, governments, and NGOs and DAOs all have to allocate capital to accomplish their goals. But capital allocation is also a place where we can start small. Every time you spend money, you are allocating capital. We are threading a through line, partnering with builders, researchers, and funders to figure out what on-chain capital allocation will look like and building it on-chain. If you want to learn more, you can visit our website at Allo.Capital, where you can download the Allo books for free, play with some of our dApps, join the Telegram, or participate in the DAO. Our guests today are Rodrigo Vasquez and Benjamin Life. Rodrigo is a program manager at the Ethereum Foundation, where he oversees grants, partnerships, and funding initiatives aimed at bolstering Ethereum's long-term resilience. Benjamin Life is co-founder and steward of Open Civics, an organization dedicated to enhancing civic engagement through participatory systems design and research. In addition to his role at Open Civics, Benjamin contributes to research and intelligence at Allo.Capital. Okay, so this episode we are discussing a report that Benjamin and Rodrigo and I collaborated on that's all about decentralizing the Ethereum ecosystem funding. So the first link in your show notes is a link to the report, and you can check it out. It's about 40 pages, and it's meant to move the conversation about the Ethereum Foundation's role in the ecosystem and Ethereum's success from the destructive forces that guide it on crypto Twitter to a more constructive place. And we really did a lot of research about the Ethereum Foundation and its core functions, and then also how past internet institutions like the IETF are set up and how they've been functional in governing the internet in the past. And what we came up with is a report that makes some recommendations for the new EF directors about how the Ethereum Foundation could improve its roles in governance and funding. And we did take a tack in doing what's best for Ethereum here and for ETH holders in this report, although there is a little bit of on-chain capital allocation wedged in the side in places where we think that it can add value. So a TLDR of the report is that we recommend that core protocol teams stay at the Ethereum Foundation and non-essential teams find a way to become independent. Public goods funding moves to more decentralized on-chain models, which will allow for more credible neutrality from the Ethereum Foundation, and also for layer twos and other foundations to fund work that is done in the ecosystem. And then finally, that governance adopts more IETF inspired openness and leadership selection. So, for those of you who are not familiar, IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force, and it is the steward behind many of the protocols and infrastructure that you know and love from the internet. So basically adopting the Ethereum ecosystem to this new era with new executive directors and new focuses is going to be a conversation. And this is our volley into the conversation to try to set a constructive tone for what changes might be viable in an open environment. So these are not backdoor conversations that are happening at the Ethereum Foundation or among whales. These are conversations that we are forefronting and providing access to everyday members of the community. And I think that that's a really important part of open governance, is to have these conversations out in the open. So this was a fun episode to produce. I think that it's an example of what a more constructive conversation about Ethereum's future could look like. It's also an exemplar of Allo.Capital's research function. How are we going to go out there and figure out how to compost capitalism, compost what isn't working in the Ethereum ecosystem, and produce the nutrients that are going to allow new organisms to thrive, that are more on-chain capital allocation, and more importantly, how do we make the Ethereum ecosystem successful? So I think that there's a lot of really fun threads in this episode. This was a real page turner for me to go through this report and to reason about what could be done in the future. And I think that Benjamin and Rodrigo are just really amazing co-stewards of this work with me. And I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Alrighty, let's get going. Benjamin, you want to start us off with an intro?
Yeah, great to be here with both of you. My name is Benjamin Life. I'm a co-founder of a decentralized organization called Open Civics, and recently started working with Allo.Capital on research and intelligence. And I really came into the Web3 space because I saw its potential for creating real disruption in a positive sense, and really helping to create systemic leverage points, instead of just trying to fix issues at the symptom. I really see Web3 and Ethereum specifically, because of its open-endedness and its plurality, as a space where we can actually create systems that really move the needle on society and our economy.
Thanks, Benjamin. Rodrigo, over to you.
Hey everyone, Rodrigo. I've been at the Ethereum Foundation for something like 3 years now, currently running the Ethereum Funding Initiative team that handles a lot of proactive grant rounds. And also, we help ecosystem projects that are public goods or that don't have sources of revenue, like dev tools, policy initiatives, to find funding. Been doing different things at the EF, including project management with some of the technical teams for a while. But I kind of gotten into this ecosystem by accident. But being from Venezuela, I've really seen how Ethereum stablecoins have impacted people's daily lives. And I think while a lot of people in the US and Europe really see this as like a speculative casino, I've seen some of the really positive impacts that it can have on places that don't have a developed financial system.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Thanks, Benjamin. So the reason that we're doing this episode today is that we've put together a research report entitled Ethereum's Future: Decentralizing Protocol Governance and Public Goods Funding. And we're going to be unveiling that today on the episode. And I'm wondering if we could start with the why behind the what. What is the reason that we put together this body of work over the last couple months? And what are you hoping to get out of the conversation? Rodrigo, maybe we'll start with you and then we'll go to Benjamin.
Sure. So, I mean, I think the first thing to note is that all of these are my personal opinions in the report. Really isn't my function at the EF to determine, the larger strategy. But given the conversation that's been happening on Twitter for the last few months, I think a lot of it has been very critical of the EF, how it functions. And, while I do agree with some of the criticism, I think what's really been lacking is a constructive conversation around what the EF can do differently, how it can address some of those concerns, instead of, having a conversation about who the right person is to lead the EF. I see a lot of the issues as more of a structural problem, and something that can be addressed by changing some of the structures in the EF and how it interacts with the ecosystem, as opposed to really being a personal issue of, who the executive director is.
Yeah, and I'll just build off that by saying that I think the culture war, despite, how good it is at, getting rage baiting engagement on Twitter, it really collapses the complexity of the conversation, and we end up having, arguments that aren't productive, as Rodrigo had said. And so I think it was starting to feel like, both sides of this kind of cultural conflict weren't really hearing each other and weren't really focusing on the kind of systemic solutions that could actually make all of the different parts of the ecosystem feel more supported by the EF. And I think that was really at the core of what was showing up on the internet was a sense that, if people are moved to, tweet something angry, it's because they really care. And so this report was really in our best attempt to provide something generative and systemic to address some of those concerns without, pretending like they don't exist, but also not getting caught up in, playing the game of blame or shame around why things are the way that they are. And I think, anyone who's ever really founded an organization, much less an entire blockchain ecosystem, realizes that, oftentimes you're so focused on building the thing that sometimes you aren't able to create the kind of long-term mechanisms that are only necessary once you've reached a certain scale and level of growth. And so I think, this combination of, Rodrigo and his deep knowledge of how the EF operates, and then Kevin and I bringing various levels of outsider perspective as part of the ecosystem was a beautiful combination of different backgrounds and perspectives to be able to see things from a little bit pulled out to be able to discern the forest from the trees and to try to orient towards something that was actually generative and systemic.
So, just to summarize, I think that there was a bunch of controversy in December and January, and it was swirling around who is the EF director? What is the purpose of the EF? Why is Ethereum, why is number not going up? And it was kind of a destructive conversation that was a pretty standard discussion in our contemporary social media environment. And the three of us out of Boulder, Colorado, said to each other, wow, this conversation does not feel constructive at all. What if we actually put together some constructive ideas about how to push the conversation forward and solve for how do we make Ethereum as effective as possible and maybe draw from some of the learnings of what's happened in the contemporary internet and the governance of contemporary internet protocols. And so that kind of snowballed for us into this report on Ethereum's future. And I'm curious if we can pull that thread a little bit more. And Benjamin, I want to go to you next and just sort of talk about in broad strokes what's in the report, and if we're trying to move the conversation from destructive to constructive, what is our volley at doing that? What are the sort of main pillars of the report that we put together?
Yeah, I think that one of the critiques that could be the most generative was just a sense that from the ecosystem itself, that, and maybe this is just frustration with the number not going up and looking for someone to blame, but I think the to just steelman that argument for a moment, I think what was attempting to be communicated there is that there was a sense of a lack of responsiveness from the EF to the needs of the community. And so the first and kind of primary part of the report is really drawing some inspiration from the early days of the internet, which I think has some really important corollaries to how Ethereum has evolved. And if this is really the substrate, the heart of Web 3, looking back at Web 1, I think can be instructive. And so, for those who aren't familiar, the history of the internet, starting out with CERN and DARPA and these kind of large sort of governmental or intergovernmental organizations, and then transitioning from, being operated interior to those institutions to having its own self-governing processes. And so this actually was really inspired by some research that was done through a Summer of Protocols grant on the Internet Engineering Task Force. And what makes the Internet Engineering Task Force really interesting is that it's a formalized governance process for how updates to the original internet protocols are held and facilitated without creating an institution around those processes. And so the first part is really drawing inspiration from how that structure is able to support a more open and transparent protocol governance process. And in addition to that, looking at how we could include more community feedback, more community participation, because even though protocol governance within Ethereum now is highly transparent and anyone can get involved, oftentimes the technical barriers to participate in that conversation are such that it's a very small group of people who are really driving the protocol. And I think what happens as a result of that opaqueness is that there's a handful of players that have an outsized influence, whether that's, particular institutions or layer twos, or protocols. There's some big players now who have really large treasuries who can allocate a lot of time and developer capacity to try to drive forward, their agenda within updates to the protocol. And that's not bad or wrong. The development of Ethereum should definitely serve those interests. And I think there was a sense that if we allow that process to continue without an additional kind of check and increasing the transparency and the responsiveness of that process to the needs of the broader community, that we might end up with some of the same pitfalls that have happened in Web 2, where you have, a very small number of monopolies that are really driving the conversation. And so at the core of the proposal is really drawing inspiration from the Internet Engineering Task Force and how they've approached protocol governance, with some additional details around how we could, even go further than that and make that process even more responsive to the needs of the community by really actively inquiring what those needs are and how the development of the protocol can serve the needs of those different parts of the community.
Thanks, Benjamin. Rodrigo, would love to go to you next and hear an overview of your main takeaways from the report.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the criticisms that were circulating around Twitter a few months ago were things that the EF should be doing that it isn't doing. Personally, I don't really see that the EF should expand its scope. I mean, I think it's always been the EF's long-term goal to reduce the scope and subtract some of the functions. I think when the EF started and this was a very small ecosystem, it could do a lot of the things. And as the ecosystem has grown, it's harder for a small organization to really keep up with that. And I think with thinking about what the long-term goal of the EF should be, I started with what is the core mandate of the EF? The EF should really not be doing marketing. I think, maybe after we've seen the recent Solana commercial that there's a good reason why nonprofit foundations probably shouldn't do marketing. And I really don't think that the EF would be good at doing that. And looking at, what the ecosystem needs from the EF, what it's really best positioned to do, and its core mandate is stewarding the protocol itself. There's a lot of functions that I think the EF is currently doing that could potentially be done outside of the organization and could probably be done better outside of the organization. And so I think having the EF really focus on protocol development, facilitating protocol development, and being a steward for the network is its core mandate. So starting with that as, the basis, then I think we can start to think how the EF can get to, its long-term goal of supporting the network and really focus on the things that it's good at doing. I think that the second part of our research was thinking of protocol governance. And that's where I think, the IETF piece comes in. Currently, protocol governance, is done through consensus on all core devs calls. It's kind of a messy process. The more client teams we have, I think is definitely better for the resiliency of the network, but it also makes it harder to get updates pushed. Every additional client team that we have on an all core devs call is additional friction in every hard fork. So having some sort of formalized governance would be better for the protocol, not only from a capture resiliency, but also from a update efficiencies standpoint. And, Ben mentioned that the goal here is really to prevent capture from large protocols. But in reality, there's really been very few EIPs proposed by anyone outside of the EF. which I think speaks to how difficult this process is. It's definitely it's open for everyone to participate. I mean, anybody can go on ETH research and post. Anybody can go to Ethereum magicians and post, but very few people do. And I mean, even those that have large economic interests in the protocol rarely participate in the EIP process. And I think that just says how high of a barrier to entry it is. And so despite it being an open process, it's really, really a full-time job just to keep up with what's going on in these forums and understanding the intricacies of the protocol. It makes it really difficult for anybody to participate. And so I think another piece of what we're talking about is creating feedback loops for the community to provide input where they don't need to write a full-blown research paper to post on Ethereum magicians or on ETH research.
And I guess I would add that the final piece, which is kind of the elephant in the room, which maybe now would be a good time to say that none of these ideas are final. And really, the purpose for us of creating this proposal was to engage this next round of broader conversation, which is why we're recording this podcast right now. And so we don't claim to have all of the answers and solutions. But in that spirit, I think the final piece that you'll find in the proposal is just an inquiry exploring how public goods funding and research funding is distributed by the EF. Because I think one of the critiques that was also coming out around that time was just a sense that the allocations didn't always make sense to the community in terms of what the priorities were that the community sensed were necessary. And I'm saying community a lot here, and that's a pretty amorphous phrase. There's actually a lot of different subcultures within Ethereum. And I think it's because of the actual diversity of different types of people who have different kinds of goals and different interests of what they think Ethereum should be. And I think for that reason, whatever the mechanism is, and I think it should be a pluralistic set of mechanisms that include, the best of centralized decision making as well as decentralized decision making. And I think part of the genius of the design of democracies is trying to balance that kind of majority rule with minority protections so that we're not just going towards the things that have the most meme value on the internet, and the EF can still play a role in shaping some elements of cryptography research and things that they have a unique specialty in being able to direct, that if you just tried to get the crowd to decide what is the most relevant cryptography research that the EF should be funding, maybe that's not an area where you want to have like a full-on direct democracy. But I think it's really important for Ethereum as a whole for there to be credible neutrality within the EF. And I think introducing some additional mechanisms around how public goods funding is and research funding are allocated would go a long way to make sure that the EF remains in that place of credible neutrality, so that they can continue to hold this ecosystem wide role and wield the power that comes with that, with the kind of restraint around funding things that might be divisive to the community, and in areas where that it could be divisive, moving that into a more democratic or at least more transparent process where those decisions are being made with more input from a larger group, so that the EF can stay in that place of credible neutrality, and the community can have a little bit more of a role in shaping what types of public goods funding the EF is allocating.
Thanks, Benjamin. So I want to give a summary of the report, and then I think that there's more rabbit holes that we can go down from there. So to start, this report is the start of a conversation. It's by no means an end to the conversation. I think that what we're trying to do is open up the aperture to a more constructive dialogue about how the Ethereum ecosystem is evolving, and especially as we're in this turning point from Aya as ED to Tamas and to the co-ED structure. What other changes would we recommend to the ecosystem? And it seems like There's in the report, the idea is that the Ethereum Foundation actually subtracts and focuses on core protocol, all core devs, and then starts to think about spinning out non-essential teams. And then public goods funding would move to decentralized on-chain models, which would allow other projects to fund the same public goods that the Ethereum Foundation funds in a more decentralized structure. There's other treasuries that are as big as the EF, and they could fund them in this model. Adopting more IETF inspired openness and randomized leadership selection, and then having a transition that happens gradually over the next several years. Those are the core points that I pull out of the report. I'm curious, is that too reductionist, or you think there's anything I missed in the overview of the report that I just put out there?
No, I mean, I think that's a good summary of the report. I did want to go back to the point of this being the start of the conversation. I know that we've been working on this for months, and we then solicited feedback from a lot of people at the EF and in the community. And I think we were kind of trying to get the perfect plan, and eventually just reach the point where we realized that we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good, and that we need to just put this straw man out there to start a conversation. And I think it's a good straw man. I don't think that this is a final plan for what is going to happen in the future, but I think it's a good starting point. Another piece, I think, from my perspective, talking about funding, I do think that we've seen the crowd can sometimes make some pretty bad decisions, especially around pretty granular technical determining what research paper should be funded is probably something that the crowd's not very good at doing, because it doesn't have the time to do the due diligence or have the technical expertise to understand the merits of one proposal versus another. But potentially the crowd has a good sense of what on a more broad general level should be funded. And so I think we can layer some of these capital allocation mechanisms in ways that solicits more participation from the Ethereum ecosystem, while also giving more decision-making power in certain situations to people with the correct technical expertise.
I would just add to that, I think one of the other concerns that this proposal is also responding to is just a sense that there is a limited treasury to allocate. And so I think that other models that allow, other parts of the ecosystem to also chip in and pay their fair share. I think one of the really interesting things that we noted, and please correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Rodrigo, is that the EF is really funding an outsized amount of the public goods and development that's happening in the ecosystem. And so I think creating mechanisms that allow, others who are benefiting from those public goods to also chip in, so that it can be more of an ecosystem wide effort, and to take some of the burden off, that being the EF exclusively, would extend the runway of the EF and allow it to have more longevity of its treasury. And then in terms of mechanisms, I think the EF has been reluctant to pick a winner, not wanting to throw its weight behind particular players in the space because that would give them an outside advantage. And I think despite that being, I think, very well intentioned and part of an aspect of the EF that is trying to maintain that credible neutrality, I think that embracing a more open-ended pluralistic approach that's, not picking one winner, but is still able to call in the builders in the space who have created different types of mechanisms that are good for different uh, types of funding, that would not be picking a winner, but would be really expanding the capacity of the EF to have more sophisticated allocation mechanisms at its disposal.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think those are all valid points. I mean, I think now the EF might be the ninth largest treasury in the ecosystem. There's definitely a lot of treasuries that are larger than the EF. And while the EF is the ninth largest treasury in the ecosystem, it still funds the majority of the public goods. Others have definitely started stepping up. There's L2s that have great grant programs, but I think with some of those, they've kind of trended away from funding pure public goods and have turned more into almost like incentive programs for people to build on, whatever specific L2 that grant program is supporting. And there's still a large number of dev tools, research projects in the ecosystem that benefit Ethereum as a whole, and that really, I think, deserve the support of a lot of the organizations in this ecosystem. I do think that, giving people a voice in how those funds are used will hopefully, provide them with the incentive to fund some of these public goods. But, I don't think we want to be in a situation where we're depending on some dev tool or some library that's underfunded and relies exclusively on the EF for funding. And, we're securing massive amounts of economic value, and there's only one organization who has a finite treasury that's responsible for really funding all of the little bits and pieces that together help secure all of this economic value.
Beautiful. I want to zero in on this being the start of a conversation and not the end of a conversation. I think there's a lot of discussions happening in and around the Ethereum Foundation and in the ecosystem around what the biggest muscles we want to build are and how to facilitate that. There's a link to the show in the show notes to a document on Notion that Benjamin is the primary author of, but we've also gotten feedback from a lot of people in the ecosystem, and would just encourage listeners to check out that first link in the show notes, open up the report and give it a read through yourself, see what you think. And if you have feedback and if you think that we're wrong, then please let us know. The first step is opening up the report and taking a look at the suggestions. And I think that if we get good suggestions from people who have a stake in the ecosystem, we'll probably host follow-up episodes to track how the report evolves from here. But Benjamin's Notion is the place where comments and feedback can come in. Benjamin, Rodrigo, anything else that we want to say about this report as we're starting to wrap the episode?
Well, yeah, I can just say that this is really motivated by a desire to see Ethereum succeed. I didn't start off my journey in Web3 as an Ethereum maxi because I thought that's kind of silly. They all have different affordances. Maybe Cardano's gonna come from behind with some really cool infrastructure. But the longer that I've been in this space, the more that I felt that Ethereum's pluralism and the open-endedness and the diversity of the community that's here, I am still bullish on Ethereum. Even as, it hasn't tracked with the rest of the market in certain moments, I haven't given up hope on the potential of what it can be. And I think that this proposal is really motivated for me, at least, by this desire to not just see Ethereum succeed, but also see it rise into something that surpasses even other parts of the world of blockchain, because of how open-ended it is, how responsive it is to its community, how different layer two ecosystems are able to become eventually interoperable, even more interoperable with each other, and the kind of effects that will have on our ability to build things that can actually help bring the world on chain and do that not in a walled garden where someone has to adopt some sort of value system in order to leverage the technology, but that it truly is an infinite garden where many different ideas, many different ideologies can actually coexist. And so it really pains me to imagine Ethereum becoming, associated with one ideology or another. I actually don't want this culture war to end in Ethereum deciding, okay, we've picked a side in the culture war in the same way that Solana did. I think I was actually so grateful to see that ad because it's like, okay, now we actually, as a community, have something to rally against. To say whatever this is more cringe than whatever the EF was doing, and again, not to pick a side in the culture war, but just to say that, we're not saying Ethereum should be X. It's actually its open-endedness and its pluralism that makes it what it is. And I feel like that's going to be the recipe for not just being the most successful layer one blockchain, but creating the kind of world that I think we all want to live in.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of those same sentiments. There's been a lot of discussion about the EF culture, being in one direction or another, but being at the EF, I can say that the EF is made up of a lot of people with a lot of different, political, cultural views, coming from, different backgrounds. It isn't, a monolith. There isn't a EF, single EF culture. And I think that's one of the things that I really like about this ecosystem too. Seeing, what discussions on Twitter were, there's a lot of points that I agree with, and I'm glad that we have an ecosystem where we can have that type of debate. I know at some points I think it got a bit toxic, but the fact that the ecosystem will heal, I think, is amazing. And we're already seeing some of that, with new organizations coming in to fill some of the void that the community saw that they wanted the EF to fill. I'm really excited about Danny and Vivek, Grant, and Zach starting Etherealize. I think addresses a lot of the things that the community wanted the EF to do, but that the EF really probably shouldn't do. And it's kind of amazing how through these discussions we're doing the thing, healing the ecosystem. And sometimes I guess from the outside looking in, it probably looks like we're just fighting each other, but the fact that we can fight each other and then continue to push for Ethereum together is what makes this ecosystem so great.
Thanks, y'all. Well, I certainly learned a lot by working on this project. And I think for me, this project was just such a breath of fresh air compared to the dialogue that was happening on Twitter, and just felt less toxic and a little bit more constructive, and appreciate the perspectives that each of you brought to the creation of this report. And hopefully it adds value in the long term to the Ethereum ecosystem and makes it an even better realization of the shared dream that we just talked about. So is there anything I didn't ask that either of you want to say? Benjamin, we'll go to you first, then Rodrigo, then we'll wrap the episode.
No, I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm really excited to hear how the community responds. Really open for feedback, and yeah, I want to continue the vibe that the three of us have set in this collaboration so far, where we're really focusing on how to make things better and not just on what's not working. So yeah, I would just invite people to engage and provide that feedback so that we can have a conversation that actually moves things forward.
The last part for me, I think I'm super excited with what's happening in the Ethereum ecosystem. I know there's been some negativity, but I feel like the ecosystem is reinvigorated and people are super driven to move Ethereum forward. So I'm hoping that we can harness the energy and get some shit done.
Here, here. Well, thanks so much for your time, Rodrigo and Benjamin. If you're listening, check out Rodrigo and Benjamin on X. There's links in the show notes, and there's also a link to the report that we've produced. So thanks again, Benjamin and Rodrigo.
Thanks for hosting us, Kevin.
Thanks, guys.
You just heard from Rodrigo and Benjamin. I'm excited about this research report because it's setting a more constructive tone for the discussions about the future of the Ethereum ecosystem. And it's also showcasing how Allo.Capital can provide value by providing research and intelligence to the community. Thanks again for listening to the Allo.Capital podcast. This podcast features the people who are building the capital allocation layer of the tokenized internet, like Rodrigo, like Benjamin. While you're here, please make an offering to our algorithmic overlords. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps other people find the work that we're doing at Allo.Capital. Peace and love. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.